Hello, dear Sleepyheads. Tonight we journey to the mist-shrouded mountains of Wallachia, to a time when the ancient world was giving way to the medieval, and to the story of a prince whose name would echo through centuries as both defender and terror. This is the tale of Vlad III, called Dracula, whose life was shaped by betrayal, warfare, and an uncompromising quest for justice that would make him legend. But before we begin this darker journey, I want to thank you for joining me. If these midnight wanderings through history bring you peace, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps me share more stories from the shadows of time. Now close your eyes and let us step quietly into the world of 15th century Wallachia to meet the prince who would become known as the Impaler. In the year 1431, in the fortress town of Sighisoara, nestled among the rolling hills of the Transylvania, a child was born who would grow to embody both the hopes and terrors of his age. Vlad III Dracula entered the world during one of the most turbulent periods in Eastern European history, when the great powers of Christianity and Islam clashed repeatedly across the borderlands, and when a small principality's survival depended on the cunning and ruthlessness of its rulers. Sighisoara in those days was a prosperous Saxon merchant town, its cobblestone streets echoing with the sounds of commerce and craftsmanship. The fortress that dominated the hillside provided security for the traders who passed through carrying goods between the Hungarian kingdom and the Byzantine lands to the south. It was here that Vlad's father, Vlad II Dracula, had established his residence while seeking support for his claim to the throne of Wallachia. The name Dracula meant dragon in the Romanian language, but it also carried deeper significance. Vlad II had been inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric society founded by the Holy Roman Emperor to defend Christian Europe against the advancing Ottoman Empire. The dragon symbol was both a mark of honor and a burden, representing the sacred duty to stand against the infidel and protect the faith. This legacy would weigh heavily on young Vlad throughout his life. Wallachia itself was a prize worth fighting for, despite its relatively small size. The principality controlled the fertile plains between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River, making it both agriculturally wealthy and strategically vital. Its position made it a natural buffer between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland. Control of Wallachia meant control of important trade routes and military access to Central Europe. Vlad's childhood unfolded against a backdrop of political instability that would shape his understanding of power and survival. The throne of Wallachia changed hands frequently, as various claimants fought for supremacy with the backing of different foreign powers. His father's rule was constantly threatened by rivals supported by Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, or ambitious local boyars who saw opportunity in chaos. The young prince's education began early, as was customary for nobility of his time. He learned to read and write in both Romanian and Church Slavonic, the liturgical language of the Orthodox Church that dominated his homeland. Latin, the language of diplomacy and scholarship in medieval Europe, was added to his studies as he grew older. More importantly for his future, he learned the arts of warfare and statecraft from men who had survived in one of Europe's most dangerous political environments. The castle where Vlad spent his early years was a place of constant tension and preparation. Messengers arrived at all hours, carrying news of political developments throughout the region. Military advisors discussed strategy in the Great Hall, while servants prepared weapons and supplies for campaigns that might begin at any moment. The young prince observed these activities with the keen intelligence that would later make him one of his era's most formidable rulers. His father's court was a melting pot of influences that reflected Wallachia's position at the crossroads of civilizations. Orthodox priests conducted services according to Byzantine traditions that traced their origins to Constantinople. Hungarian nobles brought news and customs from the royal court in Buda. Merchants from Italian city-states shared tales of Renaissance innovations and political intrigues. Even Ottoman envoys occasionally appeared, their presence a reminder of the growing Turkish power to the south. The most traumatic event of Vlad's youth occurred in 1442, when he was approximately 11 years old. His father, seeking to secure Ottoman support for his rule, agreed to send his two youngest sons, Vlad and his brother Radu, to the Turkish court as hostages. This practice was common in medieval diplomacy, intended to guarantee the good behavior of tributary rulers, but for the children involved, it meant years of separation from family and homeland. The journey to the Ottoman capital took weeks, carrying the young princes through landscapes that gradually changed from familiar European forests and farmlands to the exotic sights and sounds of the Islamic world. As their escort approached the magnificent city of Adrianople, where the Ottoman court resided, Vlad must have felt the weight of his uncertain future settling upon his young shoulders. The Ottoman court was unlike anything the Wallachian princes had experienced. The palace complex was a world unto itself, filled with gardens, libraries, mosques, and administrative buildings that housed the machinery of a vast empire. The Sultan's household included thousands of officials, guards, servants, and slaves drawn from every corner of the known world. The wealth and sophistication on display far exceeded anything available in the relatively modest courts of Eastern European principalities. Vlad and Radu were housed in quarters appropriate to their royal status, but they were nonetheless prisoners whose lives depended on their father's continued loyalty to the Sultan. They received an education that was both privilege and indoctrination, learning Turkish language and customs while being exposed to Islamic theology and Ottoman administrative practices. The goal was to transform them into reliable allies who could eventually rule their homeland as loyal vassals of the empire. The Turkish educational system was remarkably sophisticated, designed to identify and develop talent regardless of the student's original background. Young Vlad studied mathematics, literature, military tactics, and statecraft alongside other hostage princes and the most promising recruits to the Janissary Corps. His tutors were impressed by his quick intelligence and remarkable memory, but they also noted a stubborn independence that made him resistant to complete assimilation. The martial training provided by the Ottomans was particularly intensive, reflecting their empire's military foundations. Vlad learned to fight with sword, spear, and bow according to Turkish methods that had proved devastatingly effective against European armies. He studied the tactics that had given Ottoman forces victory at Kosovo, Varna, and dozens of other battlefields. Most importantly, he learned to think like a Turkish commander, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of the military system that dominated Eastern Europe. However, the years at the Ottoman court were also marked by humiliation and psychological pressure that left deep scars on Vlad's developing personality. He was frequently reminded of his status as a hostage and the precarious nature of his father's position. Turkish officials sometimes threatened him with punishment if news arrived of Wallachian actions that displeased the Sultan. The constant uncertainty about his future and his family's fate created a siege mentality that would influence his later approach to governance. The relationship between Vlad and his younger brother Radu evolved in different directions during their captivity. Radu, who was more naturally diplomatic and adaptable, gradually embraced Turkish culture and even converted to Islam. His willingness to accommodate his captors earned him favor at court and the promise of Ottoman support for his own political ambitions. Vlad, by contrast, maintained his Orthodox faith and his sense of Wallachian identity, though he was careful not to express open defiance that might cost him his life. The news that reached the Ottoman court about events in Wallachia was often disturbing for the young hostages. Their father's position remained precarious, with frequent rebellions and invasions threatening his rule. The Hungarian kingdom, under the leadership of the famous General John Hunyadi, launched repeated campaigns against Ottoman territories, sometimes with Wallachian participation or support. Each such development placed additional pressure on Vlad and Radu as their captors questioned their family's loyalty. The death of Vlad II Dracula in 1447 fundamentally changed the young prince's situation. Their father had been killed during a rebellion led by Wallachian boyars with Hungarian support, his body reportedly buried without ceremony in a monastery near Targoviste. The news reached the Ottoman court through intelligence networks that brought detailed accounts of the political chaos that had engulfed their homeland. For the first time since their capture, Vlad and Radu faced the possibility that they might never return home. The Ottoman response to these developments revealed the pragmatic calculations that drove imperial policy. Rather than simply killing the now orphaned hostages, the Sultan's advisors saw an opportunity to install a reliable puppet ruler in Wallachia. Vlad, despite his obvious reservations about Turkish culture, was deemed a potentially useful tool for extending Ottoman influence. Preparations began for a military expedition that would place him on his father's throne under Turkish protection. The campaign that returned Vlad to Wallachia in 1448 was his first taste of the warfare that would dominate the rest of his life. The Ottoman force was relatively small, designed more for intimidation than for major combat, but it included experienced commanders who taught the young prince valuable lessons about military leadership. The march through Bulgarian territories controlled by the empire showed Vlad the administrative efficiency and cultural diversity that characterized Ottoman rule. The return to Wallachia after 6 years of captivity must have been emotionally overwhelming for the 17-year-old prince. The landscapes of his childhood had changed little, but he had been transformed by his experiences at the Ottoman court. He spoke Turkish as fluently as Romanian, understood Islamic culture and Ottoman administrative methods, and had developed the political instincts necessary for survival in one of the world's most dangerous courts. Yet he had also preserved a core identity as a Wallachian Orthodox Christian that made him fundamentally different from his Turkish sponsors. His first reign was brief and precarious, lasting only a few months before Hungarian-backed forces drove him from the throne. The experience taught him bitter lessons about the realities of medieval politics and the difficulty of maintaining independence while caught between competing great powers. The boyars who had welcomed him as their legitimate prince quickly abandoned him when it became clear that his Ottoman support was insufficient to guarantee victory against Hungarian military superiority. The years of exile that followed were formative for Vlad's political and military education. He found refuge in Moldova, ruled by his uncle Bogdan II, where he could observe another approach to the challenges facing Orthodox principalities surrounded by hostile powers. The Moldovan court provided a different perspective on the balance between accommodation and resistance that defined survival in Eastern Europe. During this period, Vlad also established contact with Hungarian officials who began to see him as a potentially useful ally against Ottoman expansion. The complex web of allegiances that characterized medieval diplomacy meant that yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's essential partner. Hungarian leaders, recognizing that a Wallachian ruler with intimate knowledge of Ottoman methods might prove valuable, began to cultivate relationships that would serve their interests in future conflicts. The assassination of his uncle Bogdan II in 1451 forced Vlad to flee Moldova and seek shelter elsewhere. This period of wandering through the courts of Transylvania and Hungary exposed him to different political systems and military traditions that broadened his understanding of statecraft. He observed the feudal structures that governed Hungarian society, the merchant republics that dominated Transylvanian towns, and the military orders that defended Christian frontiers against Islamic expansion. John Hunyadi, the great Hungarian general and regent of Hungary, emerged as a crucial figure in Vlad's political development. Despite having been responsible for his father's death, Hunyadi recognized the young prince's potential value as an ally against the Ottomans. The relationship between them was complicated by mutual suspicion and competing interests, but it provided Vlad with access to Hungarian military resources and political support that would prove essential for his return to power. The education Vlad received during these years of exile was brutally practical. He learned that survival in medieval politics required constant vigilance, absolute ruthlessness when necessary, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Trust was a luxury that few rulers could afford, and loyalty was a commodity that could be bought, sold, or withdrawn at any moment. These lessons would shape his approach to governance when he finally secured lasting control of Wallachia. The death of his brother Mircea, who had briefly ruled Wallachia with Hungarian support, created another opportunity for Vlad's return to power. Mircea's reign had been marked by the same instability that plagued most Wallachian rulers, and his death left a vacancy that various claimants rushed to fill. Vlad's combination of legitimate hereditary claim, Ottoman training, and Hungarian connections made him a serious contender for the throne. The campaign that restored Vlad to power in 1456 demonstrated his growing military and political sophistication. Rather than relying solely on foreign support, he had cultivated relationships with Wallachian boyars who were dissatisfied with the constant warfare and instability that plagued their homeland. His promise to restore order and protect the principality's independence appealed to nobles who were tired of serving as pawns in the conflicts between greater powers. The victory that secured his throne was won through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and sheer determination that would characterize the rest of his reign. Vlad had learned from his earlier failures and his years of exile, developing the strategic thinking and tactical flexibility that would make him one of medieval Europe's most formidable rulers. The young prince, who had once been a helpless hostage, had transformed himself into a leader capable of defending his homeland against any enemy. As he entered the capital city of Târgoviște for the second time, now as an established ruler rather than an Ottoman puppet, Vlad III Dracula began the phase of his life that would create his enduring legend. The experiences of his youth, the trauma of captivity, the education in Ottoman methods, the bitter lessons of his first brief reign, and the hard-won wisdom of his years in exile had forged him into a ruler uniquely prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. The castle that had witnessed his childhood now became the center of a reign that would transform Wallachia from a weak and divided principality into a formidable obstacle to Ottoman expansion. The prince, who had once studied Turkish military tactics as a captive, would soon use that knowledge to inflict devastating defeats on his former captors. The ruler, who had learned the value of fear and ruthlessness in maintaining control, would earn a reputation that would outlive his reign by centuries. The morning mist that often shrouded the Wallachian plains seemed particularly dense on the day in 1456 when Vlad III began his second reign in earnest. From the windows of his residence in Târgoviște, the newly established prince could see the fertile countryside that had made his principality a prize worth fighting for. But he could also sense the dangers that surrounded his small realm like wolves circling a wounded deer. The Wallachia that Vlad inherited was a kingdom in crisis, weakened by decades of civil war and foreign intervention. The constant changes of ruler had disrupted trade, emptied the treasury, and demoralized a population that had grown accustomed to regarding their government as a temporary inconvenience rather than a source of stability or protection. The boyar class, which should have provided the backbone of royal administration, was divided into competing factions that placed personal advantage above national interest. The immediate challenge facing the new ruler was establishing his authority over nobles who had grown comfortable with the anarchic conditions that allowed them to pursue their own interests without effective royal oversight. Many boyars maintained private armies that were larger and better equipped than the forces available to the prince himself. Some controlled fortified strongholds that could serve as bases for rebellion if they chose to resist royal authority. Others had established lucrative relationships with foreign powers that provided them with resources and protection independent of their nominal sovereign. Vlad's response to these challenges would define his reign and create the reputation that has fascinated and horrified observers for more than 5 centuries. Rather than attempting to win over his potential enemies through negotiation and compromise, he chose to demonstrate the consequences of disloyalty through methods that were calculated to inspire terror rather than affection. The prince, who had learned about power in the Ottoman court, understood that fear could be a more reliable foundation for government than love or respect. The first major demonstration of his approach came during what appeared to be a routine Easter celebration in 1457. Vlad had invited the leading boyars of Wallachia to attend a feast at his court, ostensibly to celebrate the religious holiday and to discuss matters of mutual interest. The nobles who accepted his invitation expected a typical medieval gathering where political business would be conducted through subtle negotiation and social interaction. Instead, they found themselves participants in what would become one of the most notorious events of Vlad's reign. During the feast, guards suddenly surrounded the assembled boyars and arrested those whom the prince had identified as threats to his authority. Some were executed immediately, while others were condemned to forced labor building new fortifications for the royal castle. The survivors were left with no doubt about the price of opposing their ruler's will. This dramatic assertion of royal authority served multiple purposes beyond merely eliminating potential enemies. It demonstrated that the new prince possessed both the will and the power to enforce his commands throughout the kingdom. It warned other potential rebels that resistance would bring swift and severe punishment. Most importantly, it established Vlad's reputation as a ruler who would not hesitate to use extreme methods to achieve his objectives. The reconstruction of Poenari Castle, built largely through the forced labor of captured boyars and their followers, became both a symbol of Vlad's power and a practical stronghold for his regime. Situated on a mountain peak overlooking the Argesh River, the fortress was virtually impregnable and provided a secure refuge if enemies threatened the capital. The fact that it was built by men who had once considered themselves the prince's equals added to its psychological impact as a monument to royal authority. The administrative reforms that Vlad implemented during his early years of rule reflected both his Ottoman education and his understanding of Wallachia's particular challenges. He centralized authority in the royal court, reducing the autonomy that local nobles had enjoyed under previous rulers. He standardized legal procedures throughout the principality, ensuring that royal justice would be administered consistently regardless of local traditions or preferences. He also established more efficient systems for collecting taxes and managing state resources. The military reforms were even more significant, as they addressed the fundamental problem that had plagued previous Wallachian rulers: the lack of reliable armed forces loyal to the crown rather than to individual commanders. Vlad created a professional military establishment modeled partly on the Ottoman Janissary system, with soldiers recruited directly by the state and trained according to royal specifications. These forces were equipped with modern weapons and organized according to tactical principles that the prince had learned during his years of captivity and exile. The economic policies implemented during this period were designed to strengthen royal power while promoting the prosperity that would provide resources for defense against external enemies. Vlad encouraged trade with neighboring territories, particularly the prosperous Saxon cities of Transylvania, which could provide manufactured goods in exchange for Wallachian agricultural products and raw materials. He also supported the development of local industries that would reduce the principality's dependence on foreign suppliers for essential goods. However, these economic initiatives were complicated by the constant threat of warfare that made long-term planning difficult and discouraged the investment necessary for sustained development. Merchants were reluctant to commit resources to enterprises that might be destroyed by the next military campaign. Farmers hesitated to expand their operations when armies might devastate their crops during the next growing season. The very success of Vlad's military policies created conditions that limited the potential for economic growth. The religious policies of Vlad's reign reflected his commitment to Orthodox Christianity and his understanding of the Church's role in maintaining social stability. He provided generous support for monasteries and churches throughout Wallachia, recognizing that religious institutions served important social functions beyond their spiritual mission. Orthodox priests helped maintain literacy and learning in a largely agricultural society, provided moral guidance that supported royal authority, and created cultural connections with other Orthodox principalities that might serve as political allies. The relationship between Vlad and the Orthodox hierarchy was generally cooperative, though it was sometimes strained by the prince's brutal methods of maintaining order. Church leaders appreciated his defense of the faith against Islamic expansion, but they were troubled by the excessive violence that characterized his approach to governance. This tension reflected a broader challenge facing Christian rulers in frontier regions: the need to balance religious principles with the harsh, practical requirements of political survival. The cultural life of Vlad's court reflected the cosmopolitan influences that had shaped his own education and worldview. While maintaining its fundamentally Romanian and Orthodox character, the royal household included advisors and officials who brought knowledge of Hungarian, German, Turkish, and other traditions. This cultural diversity provided the prince with access to different approaches to problems and helped maintain diplomatic communications with various foreign powers. The education of young nobles in Vlad's service followed a curriculum that emphasized practical skills rather than traditional scholarly pursuits. Future administrators learned mathematics and law to help them manage state resources and implement royal policies. Military officers studied engineering and logistics to help them conduct successful campaigns. Diplomats learned foreign languages and customs to represent Wallachian interests in international negotiations. This focus on practical education reflected Vlad's understanding that effective governance required competent execution rather than theoretical knowledge. The judicial system that Vlad established became one of the most distinctive aspects of his regime, earning him both admiration and horror from contemporary observers. The prince personally involved himself in the administration of justice, often presiding over trials and pronouncing sentences that reflected his uncompromising approach to maintaining order. His goal was to create a legal system that would deter crime through the certainty and severity of punishment, rather than through the complex procedures that characterized justice in many medieval kingdoms. The most notorious aspect of Vlad's judicial practices was his use of impalement as a method of execution for serious crimes. This particularly gruesome form of capital punishment was chosen not merely for its dramatic impact, but for its effectiveness in discouraging others from committing similar offenses. The sight of criminals dying slowly on stakes served as a constant reminder of the consequences of challenging royal authority or violating the laws that maintained social order. Foreign visitors to Wallachia during this period often commented on the remarkable security that prevailed throughout the principality. Merchants could travel the roads without fear of bandits, and property was generally safe from theft. This level of public order was unusual in medieval Europe, where crime and violence were commonly accepted as unavoidable aspects of daily life. The price of this security was the brutal enforcement methods that eliminated potential lawbreakers through terror rather than deterrence. The success of Vlad's domestic policies provided the foundation for the more ambitious international objectives that would define the later years of his reign. The strengthened military, improved finances, and unified administration of his principality made it possible for him to pursue policies that would have been impossible for previous Wallachian rulers. The prince, who had once been forced to submit to foreign domination, was now preparing to challenge the great powers that had controlled his homeland's destiny. As the 1450s drew to a close, Vlad III had transformed Wallachia from a weak and divided principality into a formidable regional power. The administrative, military, and economic foundations he had built would support the epic confrontations with the Ottoman Empire that lay ahead. The ruler who had learned the value of calculated ruthlessness in maintaining domestic order was about to apply those same principles to the greater challenge of defending Christian Europe against Islamic expansion. The prince, who had spent his youth as a hostage in Turkish hands, was preparing to use everything he had learned about Ottoman methods and weaknesses in a war that would test both his strategic abilities and his psychological resilience. The transformation of Vlad Dracula from captive child to sovereign ruler was complete, but the greatest trials of his remarkable life still lay ahead in the mist-shrouded future of the Carpathian Mountains. The autumn of 1459 brought news to Târgoviște that would test every lesson Vlad had learned about power, diplomacy, and survival. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, had sent envoys to Wallachia, demanding not only the customary tribute that acknowledged Ottoman suzerainty, but also the presence of the prince himself at the Turkish court. The implied threat was clear: submit completely to Turkish authority, or face the consequences of defying the most powerful empire in the known world. The Ottoman messengers who delivered this ultimatum were experienced diplomats who had conducted similar negotiations throughout the empire's European territories. They arrived in the Wallachian capital with the confidence of men representing an irresistible force, expecting the usual mixture of protests and eventual submission that characterized their dealings with tributary rulers. What they encountered instead was a prince whose years of captivity had taught him to think like a Turk while remaining fundamentally committed to his homeland's independence. Vlad's response to the Ottoman demand was characteristic of the calculated boldness that had marked his entire reign. Rather than simply refusing to comply, he invited the Turkish envoys to a private audience where he could explain his position in detail. The meeting took place in one of the castle's smaller chambers, a setting that suggested confidential negotiations rather than a formal diplomatic ceremony. The Turkish ambassadors may have interpreted this intimacy as a sign that Vlad was prepared to negotiate his submission to their master's will. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to one of the most notorious episodes in Vlad's career. According to contemporary accounts, the prince observed that the Turkish custom of not removing turbans in the presence of foreign rulers demonstrated commendable devotion to Ottoman traditions. To help them maintain this devotion permanently, he ordered his guards to nail the turbans to the ambassadors' heads, ensuring that they would never again face the temptation to violate their customs. This brutal treatment of diplomatic representatives was more than mere cruelty or a display of temperamental violence. It was a carefully calculated message designed to demonstrate that Vlad would not be intimidated by Ottoman power and that any Turkish presence in Wallachia would be met with extreme force. The prince, who had once been forced to observe Turkish customs as a captive, was now making it clear that those same customs would be observed by Turks in his territory, regardless of their personal preferences. The news of this incident reached Sultan Mehmed with predictable results. The Ottoman ruler, who had conquered the Byzantine Empire and established Turkish control over much of southeastern Europe, was not accustomed to such defiance from minor tributary princes. The insult to his ambassadors was also an insult to his own authority, and it required a response that would demonstrate the consequences of challenging Ottoman power. Preparations began immediately for a military campaign that would either bring Vlad to heel or replace him with a more compliant ruler. The winter months of 1459 to 1460 passed in frantic preparation as both sides gathered their forces for the confrontation that had become inevitable. Vlad used this time to implement the lessons he had learned about defensive warfare during his youth at the Ottoman court. Wallachian territory was prepared for a campaign that would favor defenders who knew the landscape and could use its natural advantages against invading armies unfamiliar with local conditions. The mountainous terrain that surrounded Wallachia provided numerous opportunities for ambush and harassment of advancing enemies. Vlad ordered the construction of additional fortifications at strategic passes and river crossings, creating a network of strongholds that could channel invading forces into predetermined killing zones. Local populations were instructed in tactics that would deny resources to enemy armies while providing intelligence about Turkish movements to Wallachian commanders. The strategy Vlad developed for confronting the Ottoman invasion reflected his intimate knowledge of Turkish military methods, combined with his understanding of Wallachia's geographical advantages. Rather than attempting to meet the much larger Ottoman army in open battle, he planned a campaign of harassment and attrition that would gradually wear down the invaders, while avoiding decisive confrontations that might result in the destruction of his own forces. The spring of 1460 brought the long-anticipated Ottoman invasion, led by some of the empire's most experienced commanders. The Turkish force was substantial, including not only regular Ottoman troops, but also auxiliary forces provided by various tributary rulers who hoped to demonstrate their loyalty to the Sultan. The combined army represented the kind of overwhelming military superiority that had crushed resistance throughout the Balkans and established Ottoman control over territories that had once seemed impregnable. The initial phase of the campaign proceeded according to traditional Ottoman methods, with the invading army advancing along established routes while sending out scouting parties to locate and destroy enemy forces. The Turkish commanders expected to encounter the kind of defensive strategies they had overcome in previous campaigns: fortified cities that could be besieged, field armies that could be defeated in battle, and local populations that could be terrorized into submission. Instead, they found themselves operating in a hostile environment where every advantage seemed to favor their enemies. Wallachian forces appeared and disappeared like shadows, striking at supply convoys and isolated detachments before melting away into forests and mountains that offered countless hiding places. Food and water sources were poisoned or destroyed, forcing the Ottomans to carry their own supplies across increasingly difficult terrain. Local guides provided false information that led Turkish units into carefully prepared ambushes. The most devastating aspect of Vlad's defensive strategy was his systematic destruction of everything that might be useful to the invading army. Crops were burned, wells were poisoned, livestock was driven away or slaughtered, and settlements were evacuated or destroyed. This scorched earth policy created a wasteland where the Ottoman army could find neither food nor shelter, forcing them to depend entirely on supply lines that were constantly under attack. The psychological impact of these tactics was as important as their material effects. Ottoman soldiers who had conquered Constantinople and defeated the greatest armies of Europe found themselves struggling against an enemy they could barely see, in a land that seemed to offer nothing but death and desolation. The confidence that had carried Turkish forces to victory across the known world began to erode as casualties mounted and supplies dwindled. Vlad's personal involvement in the campaign became legendary among both his own forces and their enemies. The prince appeared wherever fighting was fiercest, directing attacks and inspiring his soldiers through his own example of fearless leadership. His intimate knowledge of local geography allowed him to predict Ottoman movements and position his forces for maximum effectiveness. His understanding of Turkish psychology enabled him to exploit the weaknesses and overconfidence of his former captors. The most famous incident of the campaign occurred when Vlad led a night attack on the main Ottoman camp, penetrating the Turkish perimeter and causing chaos among forces that had considered themselves secure in their temporary fortifications. The raid was designed not merely to inflict casualties, but to demonstrate that no Ottoman position was truly safe from Wallachian attack. The psychological impact of this bold strike resonated throughout the Turkish army and contributed to the growing demoralization that would ultimately doom their campaign. The climax of the 1460 campaign came not through a decisive battle, but through the gradual recognition by Ottoman commanders that their objectives could not be achieved under existing conditions. The Turkish army had suffered heavy casualties without accomplishing any of its strategic goals. Supply difficulties had reached crisis levels, and disease was beginning to spread through units weakened by inadequate nutrition and constant stress. Most importantly, the onset of winter threatened to trap the invading force in hostile territory, where survival would become increasingly difficult. The Ottoman withdrawal from Wallachia represented one of the most significant defeats suffered by Turkish forces during the height of their imperial expansion. The army that had entered the principality with such confidence departed as a demoralized and diminished force, leaving behind equipment and supplies that would strengthen Wallachian defenses for future conflicts. The reputation of Ottoman invincibility had been shattered by a small principality that most European powers had written off as doomed to Turkish conquest. The victory of 1460 established Vlad's reputation throughout Europe as one of the few Christian rulers capable of successfully resisting Ottoman expansion. News of the Wallachian success spread rapidly through the diplomatic networks that connected medieval courts, inspiring hope among those who had begun to regard Turkish conquest as inevitable. The prince who had once been dismissed as an Ottoman puppet was now recognized as a champion of Christian resistance to Islamic expansion. However, the success of Vlad's defensive strategy came at enormous cost to his own principality. The scorched earth tactics that had denied resources to the Ottoman army had also devastated Wallachian agriculture and commerce. Towns and villages throughout the country bore the scars of warfare that had saved the kingdom's independence at the price of much of its wealth and population. The victory had preserved Wallachia's freedom, but it had also demonstrated the terrible price that independence required in the face of overwhelming odds. The international recognition that followed Vlad's victory brought both opportunities and new challenges. European powers that had previously ignored Wallachia now sought alliance with a ruler who had proven capable of inflicting significant damage on Ottoman forces. Diplomatic communications increased dramatically as various kingdoms and principalities explored possibilities for coordinated action against Turkish expansion. The prince who had once struggled for recognition was now courted by some of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Pope Pius II, who had been organizing Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion, wrote to Vlad praising his victory and encouraging continued resistance to Turkish aggression. The papal recognition provided important legitimacy for Vlad's cause and helped establish his reputation as a defender of the faith rather than merely a rebellious vassal. This religious dimension of the conflict would prove crucial in maintaining European support for Wallachian resistance. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, despite his complicated relationship with Vlad, was forced to acknowledge the strategic value of having a successful anti-Ottoman fighter controlling the Danubian frontier. Hungarian policies toward Wallachia became more supportive, though they remained influenced by concerns about Vlad's independence and unpredictability. The delicate balance between alliance and control would continue to complicate Hungarian-Wallachian relations throughout the remainder of Vlad's reign. The victory of 1460 also had important effects within Wallachia itself, strengthening Vlad's authority over subjects who had witnessed their prince's ability to protect them against the empire's greatest threat. The boyars who had survived his earlier purges found their positions more secure, while those who had supported Turkish intervention were eliminated or fled the country. The success of his policies vindicated Vlad's harsh methods and consolidated his control over the kingdom's political and military establishments. As 1461 began, Vlad III Dracula stood at the height of his power and reputation. The prince who had learned to survive as a hostage in Turkish hands had transformed himself into one of Europe's most formidable military commanders. The ruler who had inherited a weak and divided principality had forged it into a weapon capable of inflicting serious damage on the Ottoman Empire. The stage was set for even greater confrontations that would test both his strategic abilities and his capacity for the calculated ruthlessness that had become his trademark. The winter forests of Wallachia seemed particularly dark and forbidding during the early months of 1462, as if nature itself sensed the approach of events that would push the boundaries of medieval warfare beyond anything previously experienced. In his mountain fortress of Poenari, Vlad spent the long evenings planning operations that would either establish his principality as a permanent obstacle to Ottoman expansion or result in his own destruction and the enslavement of his people. The victory of 1460 had provided only temporary respite from Turkish pressure. Sultan Mehmed II, whose armies had conquered Constantinople and established Ottoman control throughout southeastern Europe, could not allow a successful rebellion to inspire similar resistance elsewhere in his empire. The insult to his authority, represented by Vlad's defiance, required a response that would demonstrate the futility of challenging Turkish power, regardless of the cost in resources or lives. The preparations for the 1462 campaign were more extensive than any previous Ottoman operation in the region. Mehmed personally assumed command of an army that dwarfed the force deployed 2 years earlier, bringing together regular Turkish troops, auxiliary forces from tributary territories, and specialist units equipped for siege warfare and mountain fighting. The logistics required to support such a massive force demonstrated the empire's remarkable administrative capabilities and its commitment to eliminating the Wallachian threat once and for all. Vlad's intelligence network, carefully cultivated during his years of rule, provided detailed information about Ottoman preparations and the scale of the approaching invasion. The reports reaching Targovishte painted a picture of military mobilization unlike anything previously directed against such a small territory. The Sultan had committed resources that could have conquered entire kingdoms to the task of crushing a single rebellious principality, demonstrating both the strategic importance of Wallachian resistance and the personal nature of the conflict between Mehmed and his former hostage. The prince's response to this intelligence revealed the strategic thinking that had enabled him to survive and prosper in one of Europe's most dangerous political environments. Rather than attempting to match Ottoman numbers through desperate appeals for foreign assistance, he chose to exploit the very size of the approaching army as a weakness. A force large enough to guarantee victory in conventional warfare would also be vulnerable to the unconventional tactics that had proven successful in the previous campaign. The preparation of Wallachian territory for the coming invasion was even more systematic than the measures taken in 1460. Every resource that might benefit the Ottoman army was destroyed or removed, creating a wasteland that would force the invaders to depend entirely on their own supplies. Wells were poisoned with rotten corpses, crops were burned in the fields, and livestock was driven into mountain refuges where Turkish forces could not reach them. Even the trees along major roads were cut down to deny shelter and fuel to the approaching enemy. The evacuation of civilian populations from areas likely to see fighting was conducted with military precision, moving entire communities to mountain fortresses and hidden valleys where they could survive until the campaign ended. This massive logistical operation required careful planning and ruthless execution, as any delay might result in civilians being captured and used as hostages or sources of information by Ottoman forces. The success of these evacuations would prove crucial to Wallachian resistance during the months ahead. The spring of 1462 brought the beginning of what would become known as the Night Attack Campaign, one of the most remarkable military operations in medieval history. Sultan Mehmed's army crossed into Wallachian territory with the confidence of a force that had never known defeat, expecting to encounter the kind of conventional resistance that Ottoman military doctrine was designed to overcome. Instead, they found themselves entering a landscape that seemed designed by malevolent spirits to frustrate and destroy invading armies. The initial Ottoman advance proceeded according to standard Turkish tactical doctrine, with the main army following established routes, while advance guards secured river crossings and mountain passes. The expectation was that Wallachian forces would either offer battle, which the much larger Turkish army would win decisively, or retreat to fortified positions that could be besieged and captured using traditional methods. The Ottoman commanders were prepared for either scenario, but they were not prepared for what actually awaited them. The first indication that this campaign would be different from previous operations came when Ottoman scouts reported finding no enemy forces and no useful resources throughout the territory they had already occupied. Instead of the usual mixture of resistance and submission that characterized invasions of tributary territories, the Turks found only empty villages, poisoned wells, and burned crops. The countryside appeared to have been abandoned by both soldiers and civilians, creating an eerie silence that disturbed even veteran troops accustomed to the violence of medieval warfare. Vlad's strategy during this phase of the campaign was to remain invisible while constantly harassing Ottoman supply lines and isolated detachments. Wallachian forces appeared from forest hideouts and mountain caves to strike at Turkish patrols, then disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. These attacks were designed not merely to inflict casualties, but to create a pervasive sense of vulnerability among Ottoman troops who could never be certain when or where the next assault would come. The psychological impact of these tactics was amplified by Vlad's use of what would become his most notorious trademark: the systematic impalement of captured Turkish soldiers along the routes used by the main Ottoman army. These gruesome displays served multiple tactical purposes beyond their obvious psychological effect. They slowed Ottoman advances by forcing Turkish commanders to conduct burial details for their dead comrades. They demonstrated the futility of resistance to Wallachian authority. Most importantly, they established Vlad's reputation as an enemy who would show no mercy to those who threatened his homeland. The sight of hundreds of impaled Turkish soldiers lining the roads of Wallachia became one of the defining images of medieval warfare, creating a legend that would outlive the historical events that inspired it. Contemporary accounts describe the horror and demoralization that these displays created among Ottoman forces, many of whom had never encountered such systematic and theatrical brutality. The psychological warfare pioneered by Vlad during this campaign would influence military thinking for centuries to come. Sultan Mehmed's personal reaction to these provocations revealed the extent to which the conflict had become a matter of personal honor as well as strategic necessity. The Ottoman ruler, who had conquered the greatest city in the world, found himself stymied by a minor prince whose territory could fit within a single Ottoman province. The insult to his dignity and the damage to his reputation required a response that would demonstrate Turkish power, regardless of the cost, in time, resources, or lives. The climax of the 1462 campaign came on the night of June 17th, when Vlad led a surprise attack on the main Ottoman camp that penetrated to within striking distance of the Sultan's own tent. This extraordinary feat of military daring was made possible by Vlad's intimate knowledge of Turkish military procedures, gained during his years as a hostage at the Ottoman court. He understood how Turkish armies established their camps, where guards were posted, and what routes offered the best opportunities for infiltration. The night attack itself was conducted with a precision that demonstrated the high level of training and discipline that Vlad had instilled in his forces. Wallachian troops moved through the Ottoman perimeter like ghosts, killing sentries silently and creating chaos among units that had considered themselves secure in their fortified positions. The assault was designed not to destroy the Turkish army, which was impossible given the disparity in numbers, but to demonstrate that no Ottoman position was truly safe from Wallachian vengeance. The psychological impact of penetrating the Sultan's camp was enormous, both for the immediate effect on Ottoman morale and for the long-term implications for Mehmed's reputation throughout his empire. The ruler who claimed to be the successor to Caesar and Alexander had been humiliated by a former hostage whose principality possessed a fraction of Ottoman resources. The damage to Turkish prestige would resonate throughout Europe and encourage resistance in other territories that had begun to accept Ottoman conquest as inevitable. The aftermath of the night attack marked the beginning of the end for the 1462 Ottoman campaign. Turkish forces, demoralized by months of ineffective operations and shaken by the assault on their supposedly secure camp, began to experience the kind of logistical and disciplinary problems that often plagued large armies operating far from their bases. Disease spread through units, weakened by inadequate nutrition and constant stress. Desertion increased as soldiers began to question the wisdom of continuing operations that had produced only casualties and humiliation. Sultan Mehmed's decision to withdraw from Wallachia in late 1462 represented one of the most significant defeats in Ottoman military history. The empire that had conquered Constantinople and established Turkish control throughout southeastern Europe had been forced to retreat by a single small principality whose total population was less than that of a major Ottoman city. The strategic implications of this failure would influence Turkish policy in the region for decades to come. The victory of 1462 established Vlad's reputation throughout Europe as the premier Christian warrior against Islamic expansion. Kings, princes, and popes who had previously ignored Wallachian affairs now sought alliance with a ruler who had demonstrated the ability to inflict serious damage on Ottoman forces. The prince who had once been dismissed as an insignificant frontier lord was now recognized as a crucial factor in the balance of power between Christianity and Islam. However, the success of Vlad's anti-Ottoman campaigns came at enormous cost to his own principality and people. The scorched earth tactics that had denied resources to Turkish armies had also devastated Wallachian agriculture and commerce. The constant warfare had depleted the kingdom's manpower and financial resources, creating vulnerabilities that enemies would eventually exploit. The very brutality that had made Vlad an effective military commander also created a reputation that would be used against him by political rivals. The international recognition that followed the 1462 victory brought new diplomatic opportunities, but also new dangers. European powers that sought Wallachian assistance against the Ottomans were not necessarily committed to Wallachian independence if circumstances changed. The complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized medieval European politics meant that today's essential ally could become tomorrow's dangerous enemy. Vlad's challenge was to navigate these treacherous waters while maintaining the independence for which he had fought so hard. The years following the Ottoman withdrawal were marked by increasing tensions with Hungary, Wallachia's most important Christian ally. King Matthias Corvinus, while grateful for Vlad's role in checking Turkish expansion, was also concerned about the growing independence and military capability of his southern neighbor. The Hungarian monarch began to explore ways of bringing Wallachia more firmly under Hungarian influence, setting the stage for conflicts that would ultimately prove more dangerous to Vlad than Ottoman invasions. The prince, who had successfully defied the greatest empire of his age, was about to discover that victory against external enemies could create internal vulnerabilities that were even more difficult to address. The reputation for ruthlessness that had served him so well against Ottoman invaders would soon be turned against him by enemies who understood that psychological warfare could be a weapon for destroying rulers as well as defending them. As 1463 began, Vlad III Dracula stood at the pinnacle of his military and political success, recognized throughout Europe as the defender who had proved that Ottoman expansion was not inevitable. The foundations of his power seemed secure, built upon military victory, diplomatic recognition, and the grudging respect of subjects who had witnessed his ability to protect them against overwhelming odds. Yet the very qualities that had made him a successful war leader would soon create the conditions for his downfall, as the medieval world prepared to demonstrate that even the most formidable rulers were vulnerable to the shifting currents of politics and the unpredictable loyalties of allies and enemies alike. The castle walls of Târgoviște seemed to close in around Vlad during the autumn of 1462, despite his remarkable victories against the Ottoman Empire. The prince who had successfully defied the greatest military power of his age found himself facing a more insidious threat, the gradual erosion of support among the very allies who had benefited most from his success. The Hungarian court, which had provided crucial assistance during his anti-Ottoman campaigns, was beginning to view Wallachian independence as a potential threat to Hungarian interests in the region. King Matthias Corvinus faced a complex strategic dilemma that would ultimately doom his relationship with Vlad. The Hungarian monarch needed a strong ally controlling the Danubian frontier against Ottoman expansion, but he also required that ally to remain subordinate to Hungarian authority. Vlad's growing reputation and obvious military capabilities made him valuable as a buffer against Turkish invasion, but they also made him dangerous as a potential rival for influence in southeastern Europe. The diplomatic correspondence that flowed between the Hungarian and Wallachian courts during this period revealed the underlying tensions that were developing beneath the surface of their alliance. Hungarian officials praised Vlad's military achievements while subtly questioning his methods and suggesting that his brutal reputation might damage the Christian cause in the wider struggle against Islam. These criticisms were designed to undermine his international standing while providing justification for more direct Hungarian intervention in Wallachian affairs. Vlad's response to these challenges demonstrated both his political sophistication and his growing isolation from former allies. Rather than attempting to accommodate Hungarian concerns through concessions that might weaken his authority, he chose to maintain his independence even if it meant confronting former friends. The prince, who had learned to survive in the Ottoman court, understood that submission to one great power was unlikely to provide lasting security if it merely made him vulnerable to pressure from others. The specific incident that triggered the final confrontation between Vlad and King Matthias involved competing claims over control of certain fortresses along the Hungarian-Wallachian border. These strongholds had strategic value for both kingdoms, but they also represented broader questions about the extent of Hungarian influence over Wallachian territory. The disagreement escalated when Vlad refused to acknowledge Hungarian authority over territories that he considered part of his rightful inheritance. The winter of 1462 to 1463 brought increasingly urgent messages from the Hungarian court demanding that Vlad present himself at Buda to discuss their differences in person. These invitations were couched in diplomatic language that emphasized the friendship between the two rulers and the mutual benefits of continued cooperation. However, the underlying threat was clear: submit to Hungarian authority or face the consequences of defying a power that was far stronger than Wallachia. Vlad's decision to accept the Hungarian invitation reflected his confidence in his ability to handle diplomatic negotiations even with potentially hostile allies. The prince, who had successfully managed relationships with both Ottoman and Hungarian courts, believed that he could find a way to preserve Wallachian independence while maintaining the cooperation necessary for continued resistance to Turkish expansion. His calculation would prove tragically wrong. The journey to the Hungarian capital in early 1463 took Vlad through territories that had been devastated by the recent Ottoman campaigns. The sight of burned villages and abandoned farmlands served as a reminder of the price that had been paid for victory against the Turks. The destruction also demonstrated the vulnerability of small principalities caught between great powers, regardless of the military skill of their rulers or the justice of their cause. The reception that awaited Vlad at the Hungarian court initially seemed to confirm his expectations of continued cooperation. King Matthias received him with appropriate honors and conducted their early meetings according to diplomatic protocols that recognized his status as an independent ruler. The discussions focused on plans for coordinated action against renewed Ottoman threats and the distribution of responsibilities for defending the Christian frontier. However, the atmosphere changed dramatically when Hungarian officials presented evidence of correspondence allegedly linking Vlad to secret negotiations with Sultan Mehmed. The documents, which may have been forged or misinterpreted, suggested that the Wallachian prince was preparing to betray his Christian allies and return to Ottoman allegiance. The accusations were designed to justify actions that had probably been planned regardless of their validity. Vlad's arrest at the Hungarian court in 1463 marked the end of his remarkable military career and the beginning of a captivity that would last for more than a decade. The prince, who had successfully defied the Ottoman Empire, found himself imprisoned by the very allies who had benefited most from his resistance to Turkish expansion. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on contemporary observers, who noted that Christian politics could be as treacherous as any Ottoman intrigue. The charges against Vlad were never formally proven, and many historians believe that they were pretexts for actions that Hungarian policy required, regardless of their truth. King Matthias needed to establish more direct control over Wallachian territory, and Vlad's continued independence represented an obstacle to Hungarian strategic objectives. The easiest solution was to remove him from power while justifying the action through accusations of treason and betrayal. The imprisonment that followed was conducted with the courtesy appropriate to Vlad's royal status, but it was nonetheless a profound humiliation for a ruler who had spent his entire career fighting to maintain his independence. The prince was housed in comfortable quarters within Hungarian castles, provided with books and other amenities suitable to his rank, but denied the freedom to return to his kingdom or influence events in the region he had defended so successfully. During his captivity, Vlad witnessed the gradual erosion of the achievements for which he had sacrificed so much. Wallachia fell under the control of rulers chosen by Hungarian authorities, men who were more willing to accommodate foreign influence in exchange for royal support. The administrative and military reforms that had strengthened the principality were gradually abandoned, while the harsh but effective methods of maintaining order were replaced by more conventional but less successful approaches. The years of imprisonment also provided Vlad with opportunities for reflection on the choices that had shaped his life and career. The prince, who had been forced to learn survival skills as a child hostage, had applied those lessons to create one of medieval Europe's most formidable military reputations. His success in defending Wallachia against Ottoman expansion had demonstrated that small states could resist great powers if they were willing to pay the necessary price in blood and determination. However, the cost of that success had ultimately proven unsustainable. The brutality required to maintain domestic order and resist foreign pressure had created enemies among those who should have been natural allies. The reputation for ruthlessness that had made him an effective war leader had also made him a liability for Christian rulers who needed to maintain more conventional diplomatic relationships. The very qualities that had enabled his rise to power had also created the conditions for his downfall. The international situation during Vlad's captivity continued to evolve in ways that demonstrated the ongoing relevance of the strategic questions he had tried to address. Ottoman pressure on southeastern Europe remained constant, requiring continued vigilance and coordination among Christian powers. The absence of strong Wallachian leadership made the region more vulnerable to Turkish expansion, validating Vlad's arguments about the importance of maintaining effective resistance to Islamic conquest. Reports from Wallachia during this period painted a picture of gradual decline under rulers who lacked either the ability or the will to maintain the high standards of administration and defense that had characterized Vlad's reign. The kingdom that had once been a formidable obstacle to Ottoman expansion became increasingly dependent on Hungarian protection, fulfilling the strategic objectives that had motivated King Matthias to remove Vlad from power. The diplomatic correspondence that continued to flow between European courts during Vlad's captivity often included references to his earlier achievements and speculation about his possible restoration to power. Some rulers continued to view him as a potentially valuable ally against Ottoman expansion, while others regarded his removal as a necessary step toward regional stability. The divided opinion reflected the complex legacy of a ruler whose methods had been undeniably effective, but whose reputation made him difficult to integrate into conventional diplomatic networks. Religious authorities throughout Europe were similarly divided in their assessments of Vlad's career and character. Church leaders appreciated his role in defending Christianity against Islamic expansion, but they were troubled by the excessive violence that had characterized his approach to governance. The tension between religious and political considerations reflected broader challenges facing Christian rulers who needed to balance moral principles with the practical requirements of political survival. As the years of captivity accumulated, Vlad's prospects for restoration to power seemed to diminish steadily. The Hungarian authorities who controlled his fate had achieved their strategic objectives and had little incentive to risk the instability that his return might create. The Wallachian nobility had adapted to new arrangements that provided them with security and privileges under Hungarian protection. Most importantly, the international situation had evolved in ways that made his particular combination of skills and reputation less relevant to contemporary challenges. Yet the prince who had survived captivity as a child and had built a military reputation through sheer determination was not prepared to accept permanent exile from the kingdom he had defended so successfully. During the later years of his imprisonment, he began to cultivate relationships with Hungarian nobles who might support his restoration if circumstances changed. He also maintained contact with Wallachian supporters who remained loyal to his memory and his cause. The evolution of Ottoman policy during the 1470s gradually created conditions that would make Vlad's return to power both possible and desirable from a Hungarian perspective. Turkish pressure on the region increased as new campaigns threatened territories that had remained secure during his earlier reign. The rulers who had replaced him proved less capable of organizing effective resistance, raising questions about whether his removal had actually served Hungarian interests in the long term. King Matthias Corvinus, faced with renewed Ottoman threats and the obvious inadequacy of Vlad's successors, began to reconsider the wisdom of maintaining the Wallachian prince in captivity. The strategic calculations that had motivated his arrest in 1463 were complicated by developments that made his military skills potentially valuable once again. The possibility of his restoration began to appear in diplomatic discussions, though it remained contingent on his willingness to accept Hungarian oversight of his policies. The negotiations that eventually led to Vlad's release reflected the complex relationship between personal loyalty and strategic necessity that characterized medieval politics. The prince, who had once defied both Ottoman and Hungarian pressure, was now required to demonstrate his commitment to Hungarian interests as a condition of regaining his freedom. The agreement that secured his release represented both a personal victory and the acknowledgement that his independence would be more limited than it had been during his earlier reign. As 1474 approached, Vlad III Dracula prepared to return to the kingdom he had lost more than a decade earlier. The world had changed significantly during his captivity, with new threats and opportunities that would require all of his political and military skills to navigate successfully. The prince, who had once been one of Europe's most independent rulers, was about to discover whether his reputation and abilities could be restored along with his throne, or whether the years of exile had permanently altered the conditions that had made his earlier success possible. The pale winter sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Visegrad Castle as Vlad prepared for his release from more than a decade of Hungarian captivity. The man who emerged from imprisonment in 1474 bore the marks of his long confinement, though his bearing still carried the unmistakable authority of one born to rule. At 43 years of age, he was no longer the young prince who had defied the Ottoman Empire, but the intelligence that had made him so formidable remained sharp as ever. The Hungary that released Vlad was itself a changed nation, facing pressures that made his particular combination of skills and experience valuable once again. King Matthias Corvinus had discovered that the compliant rulers he had installed in Wallachia lacked the ability to maintain effective resistance against renewed Ottoman pressure. The strategic calculations that had motivated Vlad's imprisonment were being reconsidered in light of developments that threatened Hungarian interests throughout southeastern Europe. The negotiations surrounding Vlad's release revealed the extent to which his reputation had evolved during his years of captivity. European courts that had once viewed him as a dangerous maverick now remembered him primarily as the defender who had successfully challenged Ottoman expansion when others had failed. The brutal methods that had made him controversial were gradually being overshadowed by appreciation for his achievements against a common enemy that remained as threatening as ever. The agreement that secured his freedom included provisions that reflected both his continuing value and the limits that would be placed on his independence. Vlad acknowledged Hungarian suzerainty over Wallachian affairs and accepted the presence of Hungarian advisors who would monitor his policies. In return, he received Hungarian military support for his restoration and guarantees of assistance against future Ottoman attacks. The arrangement represented a compromise that satisfied neither party completely, but provided both with advantages they could not achieve independently. The journey from Hungary to Wallachia provided Vlad with his first opportunity in more than a decade to observe the changes that had occurred in the region during his absence. The countryside bore scars from repeated military campaigns, while towns and villages showed signs of the economic decline that had accompanied political instability. The population that had once prospered under his harsh but effective rule had suffered from the weaker administration of his successors. The restoration campaign that returned Vlad to power in 1476 was a pale shadow of the military operations that had characterized his earlier career. The prince who had once commanded the personal loyalty of thousands of Wallachian soldiers now depended heavily on Hungarian military support and the assistance of a relatively small number of local supporters. The kingdom he sought to reclaim had been weakened by years of ineffective governance and foreign interference. The initial phase of the restoration proceeded more smoothly than anyone had expected, as the incumbent ruler fled rather than face the returning prince whose reputation still carried considerable weight among the Wallachian population. News of Vlad's return spread rapidly throughout the principality, creating excitement among those who remembered the security and prosperity that had characterized his earlier reign. However, this enthusiasm was tempered by uncertainty about whether he could recreate the conditions that had made his previous success possible. The Wallachia that Vlad inherited for the third time was a diminished shadow of the kingdom he had once ruled. The administrative systems he had created had been dismantled or allowed to decay, while the military forces that had made him formidable had been dispersed or incorporated into Hungarian units. The treasury was nearly empty, the nobility was divided, and the population was demoralized by years of political uncertainty and economic decline. The prince's response to these challenges demonstrated both the persistence that had characterized his entire career and his recognition that changed circumstances required modified approaches. Rather than attempting to immediately restore the harsh methods that had once made him so effective, he chose to begin with more moderate policies designed to rebuild popular support and demonstrate his continued commitment to Wallachian independence. The administrative reforms implemented during his third reign reflected lessons learned during his years of captivity and his observation of Hungarian governmental methods. Vlad introduced new procedures for tax collection and legal administration that were more systematic than his earlier approaches, while remaining focused on strengthening royal authority. He also established improved communications between the capital and provincial areas, ensuring that royal policies would be implemented consistently throughout the kingdom. The military reorganization was even more crucial, as Vlad understood that his ability to maintain power depended on recreating the formidable armed forces that had once made Wallachia a regional power. However, the resources available for this effort were far more limited than those he had commanded during his earlier reign. The prince was forced to rely more heavily on Hungarian assistance while gradually rebuilding indigenous capabilities that would eventually restore Wallachian military independence. The economic policies of his third reign were designed to restore the prosperity that had been one of the foundations of his previous success. Vlad encouraged trade with neighboring territories, particularly the Saxon cities of Transylvania, that had maintained commercial relationships with Wallachia despite political upheavals. He also attempted to revive agricultural production that had been disrupted by years of warfare and administrative neglect. However, these efforts at reconstruction were complicated by the same international pressures that had always threatened Wallachian independence. Ottoman forces remained active in the region, conducting raids and reconnaissance operations that kept the principality under constant threat. The Turkish commanders who remembered Vlad's earlier successes against their forces were determined to prevent his re-establishment as an effective opponent of Ottoman expansion. The most serious challenge came in late 1476, when Ottoman forces launched a major raid into Wallachian territory designed to test the restored prince's ability to defend his kingdom. The attack was carefully planned to exploit the weaknesses that had developed during his absence, targeting areas where Hungarian support would be insufficient to provide effective protection. The result was a confrontation that would determine whether Vlad could recreate the military reputation that had once made him one of Europe's most formidable rulers. The Battle of Bucharest in December 1476 became the final test of Vlad's military abilities and his capacity to adapt to changed circumstances. The Ottoman force was substantial, but not overwhelming, designed to probe Wallachian defenses rather than attempt a full-scale conquest. The Turkish commanders expected to encounter the kind of weak resistance that had characterized Wallachian military performance during the interregnum, allowing them to demonstrate Ottoman superiority while gathering intelligence about the restored prince's capabilities. Instead, they found themselves facing a ruler who retained much of his tactical brilliance despite his years of enforced inactivity. Vlad's deployment of his limited forces demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him so dangerous during his earlier campaigns. He positioned his troops to maximize their effectiveness while minimizing their exposure to Ottoman numerical superiority, creating conditions that favored the defenders despite their disadvantages in numbers and equipment. The battle itself was fierce, but relatively brief, as both sides understood that prolonged combat would favor the larger Ottoman force. Vlad's strategy was to inflict sufficient casualties on the attackers to discourage future raids while avoiding the kind of decisive engagement that might result in the destruction of his own army. The tactical success of this approach validated his continued military competence, but it also demonstrated the constraints under which he now operated. The aftermath of the battle revealed both the possibilities and the limitations that would define the remainder of Vlad's career. The successful defense of Wallachian territory enhanced his reputation among his subjects and provided evidence that he remained capable of protecting the kingdom against external threats. However, the narrow margin of victory also demonstrated the precarious nature of his position and the constant danger that would accompany any future conflicts with Ottoman forces. The winter months following the Battle of Bucharest were marked by intensified efforts to strengthen Wallachian defenses and prepare for the renewed Ottoman pressure that everyone expected. Vlad worked tirelessly to rebuild the military capabilities that had once made his principality a formidable obstacle to Turkish expansion. However, these efforts were hampered by resource constraints and the ongoing need to accommodate Hungarian interests in his policies. The diplomatic situation during this period was particularly complex, as various European powers assessed the implications of Vlad's restoration and the results of his confrontation with Ottoman forces. Some rulers viewed his success as evidence that he might once again become a valuable ally in the struggle against Turkish expansion. Others remained skeptical about his ability to recreate the conditions that had made his earlier reign so effective. The final phase of Vlad's life was marked by increasing isolation, as the political environment that had once supported his independence continued to evolve in unfavorable directions. The Hungarian protection that had made his restoration possible also imposed constraints that limited his freedom of action. The Ottoman Empire, while temporarily checked by his military success, remained committed to eliminating a ruler whose very existence represented a challenge to Turkish authority in the region. As the winter of 1476 to 1477 progressed, reports reached Târgoviște of renewed Ottoman preparations for a larger campaign designed to eliminate the Wallachian threat permanently. The intelligence suggested that Sultan Mehmed was personally committed to finishing the work that had been interrupted by Vlad's earlier resistance, bringing overwhelming force to bear against a principality that could no longer count on the element of surprise that had once made it so formidable. The prospect of another major confrontation with Ottoman forces created a crisis of confidence among Vlad's supporters, many of whom remembered the terrible cost of his earlier victories against Turkish armies. The boyars who had survived his previous purges were reluctant to commit themselves to a struggle that might result in their destruction, while the general population feared the consequences of renewed warfare in their already devastated homeland. On a cold January morning in 1477, the man who had once been known throughout Europe as the Impaler met his end in circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. Whether he died fighting Ottoman raiders, fell victim to treachery by his own nobles, or succumbed to the accumulated stresses of a lifetime spent in constant conflict, his death marked the end of one of the most remarkable careers in medieval European history. The body of Vlad III Dracula was interred at Snagov Monastery, an island retreat that had served as one of his refuges during the turbulent years of his reign. The simple grave provided a stark contrast to the elaborate tombs of contemporary rulers, reflecting perhaps the prince's understanding that his legacy would rest on his actions rather than on monuments to his memory. The monastery itself would become a pilgrimage site for those who remembered his role in defending Christian Europe against Islamic expansion. This ends our journey through the shadows of medieval Wallachia and the extraordinary life of Vlad III Dracula, a prince whose name became synonymous with terror, but whose story reveals the complex realities of leadership in an age when survival required choices that would challenge the conscience of any ruler. May his example remind us that history is rarely simple, that heroes and villains often inhabit the same soul, and that the price of independence can be higher than any nation should be asked to pay.